58 years. That's how long a family waited to hear the name of the person who stole their daughter's life on a cold morning in 1964. For nearly 6 decades, a killer walked free while a 9-year-old girl's case file grew to 5,000 pages. More than 230 investigators tried and failed. The answer was always there, hiding behind a legal loophole and a failed system. This is the story of how justice delayed became justice almost denied, and how modern science finally dragged the truth into the light. If it's the 4th oldest cold case in the country to be solved utilizing this technology, it's the oldest in the state. This was a violent and heinous crime that was committed against a small child. This is Marise's story, and what happened to her ushered in a change in this community. And lastly, this has been a day that this family has been waiting for nearly 58 years. Before we go any further into this heartbreaking journey, I need you to do something crucial. Smash that subscribe button right now. Hit the like button so this story reaches more people who care about justice. And drop a comment below telling us what cold case you want us to investigate next. Your engagement literally keeps these forgotten victims' stories alive and pushes these cases back into the public eye where they belong. More than half a century. That is how long the Chiverella family waited for an answer that should have come in a single morning. Since the day their daughter vanished on her walk to school in 1964, time moved forward relentlessly, unstoppable, indifferent. But the truth did not move with it. The truth remained frozen, buried, hidden somewhere in the shadows of a community that would never be the same again. Pennsylvania was shaken to its core when within just 2 years, 2 9-year-old children were murdered in circumstances that seemed almost impossible to comprehend. The Commonwealth, known for its quiet towns and close-knit communities, suddenly became a place where parents feared letting their children walk to school. Where neighbors looked at each other with suspicion instead of trust. Where every stranger became a potential threat and every shadow held menace. Public trust collapsed like a house of cards in a windstorm. The Pennsylvania State Police came under fierce public scrutiny, the kind of pressure that breaks careers and destroys reputations. The media demanded answers. Parents demanded protection. Politicians demanded results. But answers were in short supply, and the investigation seemed to be going nowhere despite the enormous resources being thrown at it. At one point, it seemed the case might be solved within a decade. There were promising leads, suspects who looked good on paper, theories that seemed to make sense. Investigators worked around the clock, following every tip, chasing every possibility, determined to bring the killer to justice. But the limits of the legal system and forensic science at the time allowed a critical opportunity to slip away like water through desperate fingers. Nearly 58 years later, the name investigators had been searching for finally surfaced, emerging from the past like a ghost that had been hiding in plain sight all along. Was this a failure of investigative capability, or did the killer simply manage to hide in plain sight, protected by circumstances, by luck, by a system that wasn't yet sophisticated enough to catch him? The answer, as we'll discover, is far more complicated and far more frustrating than anyone could have imagined. Today, we revisit a mystery that challenged law enforcement for an entire generation. A case that became a symbol of everything that can go wrong in the pursuit of justice, and ultimately, a testament to the power of never giving up. Welcome to Coldcase Crimelab, where we dig deep into the cases that time forgot but families never could. The story begins on a morning that seemed like any other. It was 1964, a time when America was changing rapidly but small towns in Pennsylvania still operated on trust and tradition. Children walked to school alone or in small groups. Doors were left unlocked. Neighbors knew each other's names and watched out for each other's kids. It was a simpler time, people say, though whether it was actually safer is a question this case forces us to confront. Marise Chiverella was 9 years old, a child with her whole life ahead of her, dreams yet to be dreamed, experiences yet to be had. She was described by those who knew her as a bright, friendly girl, the kind of child who brought light into a room simply by being there. On that particular morning, she left her home to walk to school, just as she had done countless times before. It was a routine so ordinary, so mundane, that no one thought twice about it. But Maurice never made it to school that day. When she failed to arrive, concern began to ripple through the community. At first, it might have seemed like a misunderstanding, a missed communication. Perhaps she had gotten sick and gone home, or stopped at a friend's house. But as the minutes turned to hours, concern transformed into fear, and fear into panic. The search began immediately. Volunteers flooded the streets, combing through neighborhoods, checking yards, knocking on doors, calling her name. Police mobilized every available resource. The entire community came together in a desperate effort to find the missing girl, united by hope that was already beginning to curdle into dread. The discovery, when it came, shattered that community forever. Maurice's body was found, and the details of what had been done to her were so disturbing, so violent, that they would haunt investigators for decades. This was not an accident. This was not a tragic misunderstanding. This was murder, brutal and deliberate, inflicted upon a child who had been doing nothing more dangerous than walking to school on an ordinary morning. The crime scene told a story of violence that seemed almost incomprehensible. How could someone do this to a child? What kind of monster walks among us, looking normal, acting normal, while harboring the capacity for such cruelty? These were the questions that echoed through Pennsylvania and beyond, questions that demanded answers. The investigation that followed was massive by the standards of the time. The Pennsylvania State Police threw everything they had at the case. Detectives interviewed hundreds of people, following up on every tip, no matter how insignificant it seemed. They developed suspect lists, conducted surveillance, analyzed evidence with every tool available to forensic science in the mid-1960s. But here's where the story takes its first frustrating turn. The forensic capabilities of 1964 were primitive compared to what we have today. DNA analysis didn't exist. Fingerprint technology was limited. Crime scene investigation was more art than science in many ways. Physical evidence that today would crack a case wide open was collected but couldn't be fully analyzed or understood with the tools available at the time. Still, investigators persisted. They built a massive case file, documenting every lead, every interview, every theory. The file grew and grew, eventually reaching 5,000 pages of reports, notes, theories, and dead ends. 5,000 pages of desperate effort to find the person who had murdered a 9-year-old girl. And then, just 2 years later, history repeated itself in the most horrifying way possible. Another 9-year-old child was murdered in Pennsylvania under circumstances that bore chilling similarities to Maurice's case. The details varied, but the core elements were disturbingly familiar. The age of the victim. The violence of the crime. The sense that a predator was operating with impunity, striking at the most vulnerable members of society and vanishing back into anonymity. The impact on Pennsylvania cannot be overstated. 2 children, both 9 years old, both murdered within 2 years. Parents were terrified. Schools implemented new safety protocols. The carefree days of children walking alone to school were over, replaced by a new reality of fear and vigilance. The pressure on law enforcement intensified to unbearable levels. The public demanded results, and they demanded them now. How could 2 children be murdered and the killer or killers remain unidentified? What were the police doing? Were they competent? Were they trying hard enough? The questions came from every direction, relentless and accusatory. Investigators worked themselves to exhaustion. They compared the 2 cases, looking for connections, for patterns, for anything that might lead them to a suspect. Were they dealing with 1 killer or 2? Was this the work of a serial predator or a terrible coincidence? The answers remained elusive, dancing just beyond reach no matter how hard they chased them. As the years passed, the case remained open but the trail grew colder. Leads that once seemed promising fizzled out. Suspects who looked good on paper had alibis or simply didn't fit the evidence when examined more closely. The investigation continued, but momentum was slowing, and the sense of hope that had driven those early days was beginning to fade. By the 1970s, Maurice's case was still active, but it was no longer the focus of daily attention. New cases came in, demanding resources and time. The detectives who had worked the case originally began to retire, taking with them institutional knowledge and personal investment that couldn't be fully transferred to their replacements. The case file sat in storage, thick and detailed but seemingly incapable of yielding the one thing everyone wanted, a name. But something happened in 1974, 10 years after Maurice's murder, that should have changed everything. A man was arrested for a brutal sexual assault on a 23-year-old woman. The crime was violent, shocking in its cruelty, and it bore striking similarities to the violence that had been inflicted on Maurice. The victim survived, traumatized but alive, and she was able to provide details about her attacker and the assault. When investigators looked at this case, alarm bells should have been ringing. The violence. The method. The parallels to unsolved cases were there for anyone willing to see them. Here was a man who had demonstrated a capacity for extreme violence, who had attacked a vulnerable victim, who fit patterns that had been documented in the Marise Chiverella case file. This should have been the break the case needed. This should have been the moment when everything came together, when the pieces finally fit, when justice moved forward after a decade of frustration. But it didn't happen. And the reason it didn't happen exposes one of the most infuriating failures in this entire case, a failure that would allow a killer to remain free for nearly 5 more decades. The man arrested for the sexual assault in 1974 was allowed to plead down to a minor charge. Instead of facing the full weight of justice for a brutal sexual assault, instead of going to prison for years, instead of having his DNA collected and entered into databases that might have connected him to other crimes, he was allowed to plead guilty to a lesser offense. He received minimal punishment. No significant prison time. No requirement to provide DNA samples, because the technology and legal framework for that didn't exist yet. No red flag in the system that would have alerted cold case investigators decades later when they went looking for people who had committed similar crimes in the same area during the same time period. He simply walked away, back into society, his name attached to a minor conviction that wouldn't raise eyebrows or trigger deeper investigation. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this shocking story and understands why this failure of the justice system matters so much. The plea deal that allowed this man to escape serious consequences wasn't unusual for the time. The legal system in the 1970s was different from today in many ways. Plea bargains were common, used to manage overloaded court dockets and avoid lengthy trials. Sexual assault cases were notoriously difficult to prosecute, often coming down to he said she said scenarios that juries struggled with. Victims were frequently subjected to brutal cross-examination that put them on trial rather than the accused. And society's understanding of sexual violence and predatory behavior was far less sophisticated than it is today. But understanding why the system failed doesn't make the failure any less devastating. Because while this man walked free with a slap on the wrist, Maurice's case remained unsolved. The connection that might have been made wasn't made. The dots that should have been connected remained scattered and isolated. The investigation into Maurice's murder continued, but it was increasingly a background effort rather than an active priority. Detectives would periodically review the case, looking for fresh angles or new technologies that might be applied. Tips still came in occasionally, and each one was followed up, but the sense of urgency had faded, replaced by a grim resignation that this might be one of those cases that simply couldn't be solved with the tools available. The 1980s came and went. DNA technology was developed and began to be used in criminal investigations, but extracting usable DNA from old evidence was difficult and not always possible. The Marise Chiverella case file was reviewed in light of this new technology, but initial attempts to find usable DNA evidence were unsuccessful or inconclusive. The 1990s brought further advances in forensic science, but still no breakthrough in Maurice's case. The file was now decades old. Original investigators had long since retired. Key witnesses had died or moved away or simply couldn't remember details from so long ago. The case was becoming historical, a relic of a different era, a reminder of limitations and failures. The 2000th year arrived, and with it came a new millennium and new hope for cold cases everywhere. DNA technology had advanced dramatically. Genetic genealogy was emerging as a powerful tool for identifying unknown suspects. Cold case units were being established or expanded in police departments across the country, dedicated specifically to reviewing old cases with fresh eyes and new technologies. But Marise's case remained stubbornly unsolved. The frustrating truth was that more than 230 different investigators had worked on this case over the decades. 230 dedicated law enforcement professionals had pored over that 5,000-page file, had chased leads, had interviewed suspects, had analyzed evidence, had tried everything they could think of to identify Marise's killer. And every single one of them had come up empty. This wasn't for lack of effort. This wasn't because investigators didn't care or didn't try hard enough. This was because the killer had managed, through a combination of circumstances and perhaps deliberate cunning, to avoid leaving behind the kind of evidence that could definitively identify him with the technology available at the time. As the years continued to pass, the Chiverella family lived with an absence that never healed. 50 years. Then 55 years. Birthdays that would never be celebrated. Graduations that would never happen. A wedding that would never take place. Grandchildren who would never be born. An entire life, erased in a moment of violence, leaving behind only absence and questions. The family never gave up hope that someday, somehow, they would get answers. They attended every press conference. They cooperated with every new investigator who reviewed the case. They provided new interviews when asked, reliving their trauma again and again in the hope that this time, this investigator, this new approach might be the one that finally worked. And they waited. The 2010s brought another revolution in forensic technology, forensic genealogy. This technique, which combines DNA analysis with genealogical research, had begun to crack cold cases that had seemed unsolvable. The Golden State Killer case, solved in 2018 after 40 years, demonstrated the incredible power of this approach and energized cold case investigators everywhere. Could forensic genealogy work on Marise's case? Investigators in Pennsylvania began to take another look at the old evidence, this time with the specific goal of extracting DNA that could be used for genealogical analysis. The evidence had been stored for decades, not always under ideal conditions, and there was real concern that DNA might have degraded beyond usefulness. But forensic science had advanced to the point where even tiny amounts of degraded DNA could potentially yield results. The samples from Marise's case were sent to specialized labs that focused on extracting DNA from challenging evidence. And slowly, painstakingly, a DNA profile began to emerge. It wasn't a complete profile, not the kind that could be directly matched to a person in a criminal database. But it was enough to work with, enough to upload to genealogical databases, enough to potentially build a family tree that might lead to a suspect. The genealogical research began. This is painstaking work, requiring expertise in both genetics and traditional genealogical research. Investigators start with the DNA profile and look for matches in databases where people have voluntarily uploaded their genetic information, usually in hopes of finding distant relatives or learning about their ancestry. When matches are found, researchers begin building family trees, working backwards and forwards through generations, looking for people who fit the profile of the suspect based on age, location, and other known factors. In Marise's case, this process took months. Researchers identified distant relatives of the person whose DNA had been found at the crime scene. They built out family trees, sometimes going back multiple generations to find common ancestors. They worked forward from those ancestors, identifying descendants who would have been the right age and in the right location in 1964. And slowly, a name began to emerge from the genealogical research. A name that appeared in the family trees. A name of someone who had been in the area at the time. A name that, when investigators looked into it, made their blood run cold. Because it was a name that had appeared in the case file before. Not as a primary suspect, perhaps, but as someone who had been interviewed, someone who had been looked at, someone who had been in the orbit of the investigation decades earlier. And it was the name of the man who had been arrested for that brutal sexual assault in 1974 and allowed to plead down to a minor charge. The man who had slipped through the justice system and walked away had been Maurice's killer all along. The confirmation process required additional steps. Investigators couldn't simply arrest someone based on genealogical research alone. They needed to confirm the DNA match directly. This meant either obtaining a new DNA sample from the suspect through legal means or finding an existing sample that could be tested. The suspect, it turned out, had died. He had lived a long life, decades longer than Maurice ever got to live, and had passed away without ever being held accountable for what he had done. But DNA could still be obtained. Family members were approached, some of whom provided samples voluntarily once they understood what was happening. Other samples were obtained through legal processes. And when the direct comparison was done, when the DNA from Maurice's case was compared to the DNA of the suspect, it was a match. After 58 years, the killer had been identified. The name that investigators had been searching for since 1964 was finally known, definitively, scientifically, beyond any reasonable doubt. The press conference announcing the resolution of the case was emotionally overwhelming. The Chiverella family, now multiple generations removed from the tragedy that had shaped their lives, finally heard the words they had waited 58 years to hear. They knew who had killed Maurice. They knew why it had taken so long to find him. They knew about the 1974 arrest and the plea deal that had allowed him to escape justice. The oldest member of the Chiverella family at that press conference had been waiting since they were a teenager. They had grown up, had a career, had children and grandchildren, had lived an entire adult life in the shadow of this unanswered question. And now, in their later years, they finally had an answer. This has been a day that this family has been waiting for nearly 58 years, the police spokesman said, and the weight of those years was visible on the faces of the family members present. 58 years of not knowing. 58 years of wondering if they would ever get answers. 58 years of watching the case grow colder and colder while the killer lived free. But there was frustration mixed with the relief. Because the suspect was dead, there would never be a trial. There would never be a moment where the family could face him in court, where they could hear him confess or at least be forced to hear the evidence against him. There would never be a guilty verdict, never a sentencing, never any form of accountability or punishment. He had escaped justice in life, and death had provided him with a final escape. The only consolation was that the truth was finally known, that his name would forever be associated with this crime, that history would record him as a child killer, that whatever legacy he might have hoped to leave behind was now irrevocably tainted. The revelation about the 1974 arrest and plea deal sparked outrage and led to broader conversations about how the justice system handles violent crimes and plea bargains. How many other cases were out there where someone had been allowed to plead down from a serious violent crime to a minor charge? How many other predators had slipped through similar cracks in the system? Legal reforms have been implemented over the decades, partly in response to cases like this. DNA collection from convicted criminals is now standard. Databases allow for cross-referencing between cases in ways that weren't possible in the 1970s. Plea bargains for violent crimes face more scrutiny. Victims' rights have been strengthened. But these reforms came too late for Maurice, and they came too late for the victim of the 1974 assault who had to watch her attacker walk away with minimal punishment. The resolution of Maurice's case was significant not just for her family but for the field of cold case investigation. If this case, more than half a century old, could be solved using modern forensic genealogy, what other cases might be solvable? How many other families might finally get answers? Investigators noted that this was the fourth oldest cold case in the country to be solved using forensic genealogy technology, and the oldest in the state of Pennsylvania. This represented a significant achievement and offered hope for other long unsolved cases. But it also highlighted the limitations that had existed for so long. For 58 years, the answer had been theoretically discoverable. The killer's DNA had been in the evidence all along. His name had been in investigative files due to his 1974 arrest. The connections were there, but the technology to make them definitive didn't exist until recently, and the legal system had failed to keep him in custody or under surveillance after that 1974 case. The case raises profound questions about justice delayed and justice denied. The Chiverella family got their answer, but they never got their day in court. The suspect lived out his natural life and died without ever being held accountable. From a legal standpoint, he was never convicted of murdering Maurice, even though investigators are certain he did it. Is that justice? It's a question without an easy answer. For the family, having the answer was clearly meaningful, even without a trial or conviction. They could finally stop wondering. They could finally have certainty about what had happened and who was responsible. They could grieve with full knowledge instead of lingering questions. But it wasn't the justice they had hoped for. It wasn't the justice Maurice deserved. It was incomplete, unsatisfying, a footnote instead of a conclusion. The case also serves as a reminder of how many cold cases remain unsolved. Across the United States, there are hundreds of thousands of unsolved murders, many of them from decades ago when forensic capabilities were limited. How many of those cases have evidence sitting in storage that could be reanalyzed with modern technology? How many could be solved if resources were dedicated to the effort? Funding for cold case investigations is often limited. Police departments are stretched thin dealing with current crimes and don't always have the resources to dedicate significant time and money to cases from decades ago. Forensic genealogy is expensive and time-consuming. DNA extraction from old evidence is challenging and not always successful. But cases like Maurice's demonstrate that solutions are possible, even after many decades, even when traditional investigative methods have been exhausted. The 230 investigators who worked on Maurice's case over the years weren't working in vain. Every interview they conducted, every piece of evidence they collected and preserved, every note they made in that 5,000-page file contributed to the eventual resolution. The suspect's name appearing in old files helped confirm the genealogical findings. The preservation of physical evidence made DNA extraction possible decades later. In a very real sense, those investigators did solve the case. They just didn't have the tools to complete the solution until 58 years had passed. The technological advances that made this resolution possible are accelerating. Forensic genealogy techniques continue to improve. DNA extraction methods become more sophisticated. Databases grow larger and more comprehensive. The number of cold cases being solved using these methods increases every year. But there are ethical and privacy concerns as well. The use of public genealogical databases for law enforcement purposes has sparked debate about privacy, consent, and the appropriate use of genetic information. Some database companies have restricted law enforcement access. Laws are being written and rewritten to address these concerns. The balance between solving crimes and protecting privacy is delicate and important. But for families like the Chiverellas, the ability to finally get answers after decades of uncertainty is invaluable, worth careful consideration of how to implement these technologies responsibly. What happened to Maurice in 1964 was a tragedy that should never have occurred. A child should have been able to walk to school without fear. A predator should not have been able to strike and vanish. And when that predator was arrested a decade later for another violent crime, the system should not have let him walk away. Every failure along the way, the limitations of forensic science in the 60s, the plea bargain in the 70s, the decades of cold trail, compounded the tragedy, adding layers of frustration and pain to a family that had already suffered the worst loss imaginable. But the persistence of investigators over those 58 years, the advancement of forensic science, and the dedication of modern cold case teams finally broke through those barriers and delivered the answer that had been sought for so long. Maurice's story is now complete in a way it wasn't before. The mystery of what happened to her has been solved. Her killer has been identified. The truth, so long hidden, has finally been brought into the light. It's not perfect justice. It's not the accountability that should have happened decades ago. But it's resolution, and for a family that has waited 58 years, that means everything. The case stands as a testament to the importance of never giving up on cold cases, never assuming that too much time has passed for answers to be found, never accepting that some mysteries are simply unsolvable. Technology will continue to advance. Techniques will continue to improve. More cases will be solved. More families will get answers. And perhaps, in some small way, each solution honors not just the victim whose case is resolved but all the victims of unsolved crimes, all the families still waiting for answers, all the investigators still working cases that others have given up on. Marise Chiverella's case took 58 years to solve, but it was solved. That's a powerful message of hope for every other cold case still waiting for its moment of resolution. This was a violent and heinous crime committed against a small child, and it ushered in a change in the community. It demonstrated the worst that human beings are capable of and the best the dedication of investigators who never stopped trying, the love of a family that never stopped hoping, the march of science that eventually provided the tools to find truth. 58 years is a long time to wait for justice. It's a lifetime for some. It's multiple generations for others. But the wait, as long and painful as it was, eventually ended with an answer. And that answer, incomplete and imperfect as it may be, finally allows Marise to rest with her name cleared from the list of unsolved victims, her case moved from the cold files to the solved column, her killer identified for all of history to know. This story didn't have the ending anyone wanted. But it had an ending, and sometimes, after 58 years of silence, that's enough. We've journeyed through nearly 6 decades of frustration, failure, persistence, and finally resolution. If this case moved you, if Marise's story matters to you, if you believe that every victim deserves justice no matter how much time has passed, then I need you to take action right now. Subscribe to Coldcase Crimelab and turn on notifications so you never miss another story. Hit that like button to push this video to more people who care about unsolved cases. Share this video with someone who believes that the truth should never stay buried. And leave a comment telling us what cold case you want us to investigate next. Every subscription, every like, every share, every comment helps keep these stories alive and reminds the world that victims like Marise should never be forgotten. Let's keep fighting for justice together, no matter how long it takes.